Dennis, this video is for you. We can alter it around and change it as you want, but let me know what you think about it. Welcome to this short video about the cardiac science G3 automated external defibrillator. In this video, we're going to go through three different aspects of using the AED. The first will be to look at the contents of the AED itself and to check it to make sure it's in a functional capacity. The second element will be to actually apply the AED, and in this scenario we're going to be using a mannequin to apply the AED onto. And the third will be to look at how the AED actually works. So into section number one. So the first thing we're going to do is actually look at the AED itself. So this is the Cardiac Science G3 automated external defibrillator. It comes in its own carry pack, which has got a couple of features on its own. So the first feature is there's a little pocket on the side here which is designed for some scissors. The idea of these scissors is that we can use them to cut clothing off, and we'll demonstrate that in the next section. Around the back of the AED, in this section here is a pocket, so there's a nice zip to use, and you get a number of features in this pocket. Now, depending on your training and what your local environment is, will depend on what features you have. But a couple of things which are important. First of all, we may have a towel so that we can dry any perspiration off of the patient. We also might have a razor of some kind so that we can shave any hair if it's in the way of where the pad needs to go. And if you have got a razor, you might also consider having a sharps container to place the razor in. And then you may have some personal protective equipment. So you might just have a simple face barrier. So something simple like that, so that you can also do mouth to mouth. You may have a much more comprehensive pack, which would consist of lots of things: apron, gloves, mask, waist bag, etc. And finally, you may have some disposable goggles as well. So all of your personal protective equipment is kept in the back there, and on some occasion you might have a spare set of pads in there as well. Let's have a look at the front of the automated external defibrillator. So the first thing is there's a window here, and we'll be looking closer at that window because that's got the date of the expiry of the pads. The next thing we're going to do is look at this little window up here, which currently has got a green light, and that's good. If there's a green light, it means that the AED is operational and it's ready to go. So always look for that green light. If you haven't got a green light, so if the light is red, so let's look at this one. If you've got a red light on there instead, then there's something wrong with the AED. There's only two things which can go wrong with this AED. One is the pads are not connected, and two, the battery is flat. So we're now going to look at both of those elements. Okay, so on this AED, because we've got a red light showing on there, we need to investigate what might be wrong. So we're going to open the AED up by simply popping this back here. This lid comes open, but the AED stays attached within there. And the first one is there's no battery in the bottom of this AED. So if I just place a battery in there, this is what the battery looks like. So this is how the battery comes, a new battery. It's a completely sealed unit, and it's normally got a 5-year shelf life on it, and you can check the dates of your battery on there. So with our AED, if we need to pop a battery in, it is as simple as the end of it goes in, and then you can see that just pushes up. If we need to remove the battery, on the bottom here, little lever comes out, and then the battery lifts out of where it goes. So let's pop this battery in. So that battery's now in, but we've still got a red light. So the next thing we need to check is the pads on here. And as we can see, there's an expiry date on the pads, but it's whether the pads are connected. And that's what makes the difference. So as we open up the lid, so we just press this button and the lid opens, we can now see that the wire is not connected to the pad. If we turn it around for you to see, we can see here that there's a connection, and we can see how on the end of the pads there's a red and a white, and there is in this little connection block here, and all we need to do is push that in so it's round the right way. Like so. You can see that there. Now that everything's together, if the red light doesn't come on, the red light doesn't go off instantly, what you need to do is open and close the AED again, and then it resets itself. So something you should be aware of is this AED is programmed to do a self-test every 24 hours. And normally it's at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's a self-program, there's nothing you can change on it, it's all preset. So every 24 hours at 2 o'clock in the morning, the AED will do a self-check. If the AED finds a fault at that time, it will start to beep. And when you hear that beeping, it's another indication that there's a problem with the AED. If the battery is flat, or if the pads are not connected, it will start to beep. Other reasons why it will start to beep is because the AED has got too cold. So if it is left outside in minus temperatures, so freezing conditions, the AED can get too cold, and that may also cause it to start to beep. There is some software and a data cable that you can also get, which you can connect to the AED, and you can connect it to a computer, and you can then diagnose what the problem is, or you'll have to go back to the manufacturer. Okay, so now we've had a look at the AED, we've had a look to make sure the AED has got all the right components on it, we've checked all the bits and pieces, we've had a look to make sure that there's a green light on, there's pads in date, and everything's in the back. So we're now ready to go on to stage number 2, and we're going to look at actually using this AED on a patient who we have diagnosed to be non-breathing and in cardiac arrest. So on arrival at your patient, you will do everything you're trained to do and assess your patient. You're bringing your AED. I would recommend carrying it in your left hand. So as you place it down, it goes to the left hand side of the patient, which means your scissors are closest to you, which we're going to use now. So you've already identified your patients in cardiac arrest. The AED is to the left. The first thing you take is your scissors. You may have some other PPE on this time, but if you're going to cut clothing off, I would always suggest you start nearest the neck and you cut down. Now, sometimes when you start cutting, you can then rip the clothing, but we need to be completely down to bare chest. So as I cut through the next layer, any layers we'll need to cut through. So we will have to expose. This little bit here is just because it's a training mannequin, so we're going to ignore that for now. Now we've got a bare chest, we're going to look for our 5 P's and our H. So I'm looking for perspiration. Do you remember in the back of our AED we had that cloth? So if there's any perspiration, I can dry the patient off. So that's what the cloth was for, any perspirations. That's the first one. I'm then going to look for any pendants. So if there's any jewellery, any necklaces, they need to be removed and out of the way. So perspiration, pendants. I'm now looking for any patches. So if there's any skin patches, it may be a plaster or a patch, I'm going to remove it. I'm then going to look for a pacemaker, and normally a pacemaker scar is on the left. If so, that's fine, but if it was on the right, never ever put your pads on top of a pacemaker. And the final one is piercings. So sometimes people have different piercings, and if we can, we'll remove them, particularly on the left-hand side. So looking for perspiration, pendants, patches, pacemaker, and piercings. And our H is we're looking for hair. Now, if there was hair, and it was significant hair, I might need to shave the hair where the pad's going to go. But there is no hair on this one, so we're good. So I've gone through my 5 P's and my H. I now can open up my machine. 2 little tags on the side, drop them back, lift the lid, and then I'm going to press this button, press that and open it. And as I do so, the machine automatically turns on. I don't need to turn it on at all, it automatically comes on.
Open package and remove pad.
So I listen to what the machine tells me to do.
Open package and remove pad.
So when I look at the pads, there's a bit to tear.
Open package and remove pad. Peel 1 pad from plastic liner.
Okay, so just following what it says.
Peel 1 pad from plastic liner. Peel 1 pad from plastic liner. Place 1 pad on bare upper chest.
So place the
Place
pad,
1 pad on bare
upper chest.
Place 1 pad on bare upper chest. Peel 2nd pad and place on bare lower chest as shown.
So again, I'm looking at
Peel
the
2nd
pictures,
pad
and
place
this
on
pad
bare lower chest
comes
as shown.
all the way
Single
around
touch
to here.
patient.
Once the pad is on,
Rhythm.
make sure nothing is touching the
Do not
patient.
touch patient. Analyzing rhythm. Shock advised.
Okay, so
Charging.
nobody touching the
clear.
patient. You
Push
can now
flashing
see this
button
light's
to deliver
flashing.
shock.
Okay, so everyone clear. Press the
Shock
button,
delivered.
the body would jump.
It is now safe
I would
to
then
touch the patient.
Start
Start
my
CPR. Give
chest
30
compressions.
compressions. Then give 2 breaths.
Now, depending on what CPR you're doing, you would then carry that on. Let's have a closer look at the actual machine. So, as we can see from the machine, these lights here are for my battery to tell me how much is in there, but I've also got this little screen here, and as you can see from the screen, it's telling me how many shocks I've delivered, how long I've got until my next shock. So I've got just over a minute left, and this is how long the machine's been on. So this one's counting upwards to how long the machine's been on, and this one's counting downwards to when my next shock is due. So I will carry on doing my CPR until this counts down. So I've got another minute left, and it will keep doing the same. Every 2 minutes, it will automatically reanalyze the heart rhythm. And with our pads, we can see how we've put one just underneath the right collarbone, and the other pad is just underneath the left breast, underneath the left armpit. So it's right the way round to the side. Okay, so we're coming up now to that second analysing. So let's see what our machine says this time, whether we're going to be shocking again or not. remembering we would be doing CPR the whole time, whether that would be just our chest compressions or doing our ventilations as well. If we are doing our both, we'll be doing 30 to 2.
Stop CPR.
Okay, stop, because the
Do
machine
not
says.
touch patient. Analyzing rhythm. Do not touch patient. Analyzing rhythm. Shock advised.
So we're going to shock again.
Charging.
Make sure nobody is
Stand
touching
clear.
the patient.
Push flashing
Finger on the button,
to
but
deliver
I'm
shock.
looking at the patient. Everyone clear, top, middle, bottom.
Stand
Shock. The
delivered.
body would
It is now
straight
safe
back on,
to touch the patient.
and my
Start
2-minute timer
CPR.
has started again
30
on here.
compressions. Then give 2 breaths.
So it encouraged me to do the normal resuscitation. If anything goes wrong with our machine, we may hear little things like the AED will not always advise to shock. In part 3, we're going to have a look at how the AED works, how the heart works, and why it advises a shock and when it doesn't advise a shock. In part 3 of this video, we're going to be talking about how the heart works and how the AED is able to deliver a shock. So the first thing, we need to understand our heart. Our heart is a unique muscle which sits centrally in our chest. So it'll be sitting here, so it lays at an oblique angle, so it does come across to the left hand side. In our heart, it's made up of different chambers, the 4 different chambers, and that's what pumps the blood around. But what we're interested in is the electrical activity of the heart. And the electrical activity of the heart is what causes the heart to contract, and then it squeezes the blood from one chamber to the other and then out again. Whilst we've got continuous electrical activity of the heart and the heart is pumping as it normally would, this is what we call normal sinus rhythm. And if we was to have a look at that on the board here, let's have a look. So, normal sinus rhythm. And that would look like this. First of all, we see a little bit of flat line, the electrical activity. Then we see a P wave as the electrical activity goes through the atria. Then we get a Q wave where it goes in a downward deflection. Back down and up, and then we finish with a T wave and into the next one. Now, my drawing's not particularly brilliant, but this is what it looks like on a screen. So we can see there, that is normal sinus rhythm, and that is the heart beating as it normally would. And while that's happening, the heart is quite happy. But when the heart goes into a rest and the heart actually stops beating, that's when it does something different. One of the most common things that the heart will do is go into what we call VF. That is ventricular fibrillation. This is when the heart starts to quiver. instead of the electrical activity having a nice pulsation through the heart, actually the electrical activity has all gone haywire, and on our monitor we see all this. It's all over the place. So if we come back to our monitor and have a look, fibrillation. So if we look at that top one compared to the bottom one, we can see the big difference there. So the bottom one is still the normal sinus rhythm, and that top one is ventricular fibrillation. Now that is a shockable rhythm. The AED will only identify shockable rhythms. That's the only thing it can do. So if I placed an AED on a person who was still in normal sinus rhythm, it would not shock them. It can't. If it places it on someone in ventricular fibrillation, it would advise a shock, as we saw before, and that shock stuns the heart and hopefully resets the heart back into the normal sinus rhythm. There's one other rhythm that I want to show you, and that is called asystole, or known as flatline. So if they're in asystole, then we just get a flat line like so. And again, if we come back to that monitor and we have a look, we can see that top line there is asystole. The bottom one is still the normal sinus rhythm, so you can just see the difference there. But that asystole, the heart has stopped. If the AED identifies asystole, well, it can't identify asystole, it would not recognise it, it wouldn't do anything. It would tell you to do CPR. So they're the three main rhythms that our heart will be in. There is another one called VT, ventricular tachycardia. I'm not going to go into that one because it's slightly more complex. We just need to worry about these. The point is, the AED only recognises ventricular fibrillation. So it doesn't matter if the heart is beating normally or the heart has completely stopped or something else is going on. The AED will only advise a shock if it identifies ventricular fibrillation. If it does, remember we've got one pad above the heart, one pad to the side of the heart, and because the normal electrical activity goes across the heart down the septum here, then the shock wave will do the same. And the idea is it suddenly shocks it back into a normal sinus rhythm. The way that works is if we think about the electrical activity all going haywire and all going all over the place, the shock actually stuns that into stopping. So in fact, the shock actually stops the heart altogether, and then it allows it to resynchronize itself back into the normal sinus rhythm. So there's one more very, very important thing just to mention here as well, and that is if you do find that someone's in ventricular fibrillation, you'd be doing chest compressions and CPR, you then shock them, you immediately do 2 minutes of chest compressions. Do not find out if normal sinus rhythm is there for 2 minutes. That's really important. So you start your chest compressions as early as possible and you keep them going. So the rationale for that, it's a little bit like if you bump start a car or a motorbike. So can you imagine when the battery goes flat on the car or the motorbike, you may have a heel or somebody pushing it and you kind of push it down and then suddenly you bump start it. The next thing you've got to do is rev the engine. So give the engine lots of revs to keep it going and ticking over. If you bump start that motorcycle or that car and you don't give it the revs, it will just die off again. And that is exactly what is happening here. So the heart was working normally, it's then gone into ventricular fibrillation, but your chest compressions are keeping that going. The AED identified that the heart was in a shockable rhythm, so then the AED decided it would then shock, so that bump start, you've then got to rev the car by going more with the chest compressions. So that really is an important feature that you need to do. And the last thing to say, the heart may be in a systole, this flat line. It doesn't matter. We can't tell from the outside. The AED does not know what a systole is. It will not shock it. There's no point because there's no electrical activity to get it started. It'd be a little bit like bump starting that car that hasn't got any fuel in it or hasn't got a battery in it. So actually you push it along, you go to start it, nothing happens. No point doing anything else. You can keep on pushing the car, but nothing's going to happen because there's nothing in there to do. So the only thing we can do here, you wouldn't know they're in this, is CPR. The chest compressions, maybe alternating with the ventilations if that's what you've been trained to do. But the point is, both of these are cardiac arrest. So when we identify cardiac arrest, the heart has done something else. It's no longer beating like it should. It might be quivering or it might just be sat still. Doesn't matter. You just do your chest compressions, put the AED on. If the AED advises a shock, it must have found the ventricular fibrillation. If it didn't identify the shock, just keep going with chest compressions. I hope this short video has been of some use to you. We've gone through 3 different elements. We've looked at the actual cardiac science G3 and making sure that it's operational. We've then looked at using it on a simulated environment in a cardiac arrest with a mannequin. And then we've looked at the rhythms of the heart and how the AED works.